There's something unsettling about the Finch house. A towering, chaotic structure filled with forgotten rooms and sealed-off memories, each one a tombstone to a family member lost too soon. What Remains of Edith Finch isn't just a game, it's an autopsy of an entire bloodline, a story about the weight of memory and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the inevitable. Developed by Giant Sparrow, this narrative-driven experience has often been described as a meditation on mortality, but that barely scratches the surface. In this video, we're going to talk about what I think makes this game such a uniquely haunting experience, how it explores grief, legacy, and the ways we use stories to cope with the things we can't escape. As always, this video will be full of spoilers, so keep that in mind. And if you enjoy this content, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more. So, sit back, get cozy, and join me as we explore what remains of Edith Finch's psychological story at midnight. What Remains of Edith Finch was never meant to be this. In the beginning, it was something completely different. A scuba diving simulator titled The Nightmares of Edith Finch, a quiet exploration of the ocean inspired by writer and director Ian Dallas's childhood in Washington State. But there was a problem. How do you tell a compelling story when everything is happening underwater? The ocean is vast, beautiful, and completely isolating. The team at Giant Sparrow wrestled with this for months until finally they made a decision. The ocean was scrapped, and in its place, the Finch house was born. A towering, impossible structure, a labyrinth of memories and sealed-off rooms, each one a monument to a life lost too soon. But if you look closely, you can still see traces of that original idea. The way the text floats on the screen, gently guiding the player through each story, that was a direct holdover from the underwater concept. And that surreal, dreamlike shift between reality and imagination, that found its way into Molly's story as she transforms into a cat, an owl, and eventually a shark tumbling from the sky. The ocean may have disappeared, but its ghost lingers, woven into the DNA of Edith Finch's storytelling. When the game finally launched in 2017 for PlayStation 4 and PC, with later releases on Xbox One and the Nintendo Switch, it was met with overwhelming critical acclaim, going on to win Best Game at the BAFTAs in 2018. And while some complained about its short runtime, which, by the way, took me forever to find, I actually had to filter through negative Steam reviews just to see what people didn't like about this game. Others saw it as one of the most emotionally resonant experiences gaming had to offer. Drawing inspiration from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude and shows like The Twilight Zone, Doctor Who, and The Prisoner, as well as a host of other inspirations listed in their original concept document, What Remains of Edith Finch is a game that refuses to be put in a box. It's not just a walking simulator. It's not just an anthology of tragedies. It's an exploration of how we use stories to make sense of the things that scare us the most. Our past, our family, and the inescapable certainty of death. But here's the thing, what makes Edith Finch so special isn't just what it tells you, it's how it tells you. And to understand that, we need to step inside the Finch house and take a closer look at the ghosts that still linger there. And with that, let's get into the game itself. I'll provide a summary of the game just in case you've either never heard of it or would like a refresher, but feel free to skip to this section if you just want the analysis. The story begins with a nameless child aboard a ship, thumbing through the opening pages of Edith Finch's diary. And then, just as quickly, we shift. The real story begins. Edith, the last known member of the Finch family, steps foot onto the grounds of her childhood home, a place that looms impossibly large in both scale and significance. This house is more than just a structure. It's a mausoleum, a living testament to the weight of her family's history and the secrets that her mother desperately tried to keep from her. Edith's journey is one of exploration, of remembrance. Each bedroom in the Finch house is a frozen moment in time, perfectly preserved since the day its occupant left this world. one vanishing without a trace, the rest meeting fates that feel more like myths than reality. Her mother, Dawn, in an attempt to protect Edith, had sealed most of these doors shut. But Edith isn't here to be protected, she's here to know. And so, she crawls through hidden passageways, squeezes through forgotten vents, and steps into the intimate, final moments of those who came before her. The first stop? Her great-aunt Molly's room, the bedroom of a 10-year-old girl left untouched for decades, frozen in time like a childhood memory that refuses to fade. Inside, a diary. And with its pages, a transformation. It's 1947. Molly, locked in her room without dinner, grows desperate. She eats anything within reach. Gerbil food, toothpaste, even what may or may not be poisonous holly berries. And then something happens. Something beyond logic, beyond reality. She becomes a cat, then an owl, then a shark, then a monstrous slithering beast. Each form is driven by an insatiable hunger, culminating in one final transformation, a return to her room, a final entry in her diary. Something is coming for me. And then, silence. Was this the fevered imagination of a starving child? A metaphor for something darker? No answers, just an eerie absence. Leaving Molly's room, Edith moves deeper into the house, finding herself in the domain of Edie, her great-grandmother. The family's historian, a woman obsessed with immortalizing the dead. The walls are adorned with paintings of lost finches, stories twisted into legend. Her husband, Sven, didn't just fall to his death, he was slain by a dragon. Her father, Odin, didn't just drown at sea, he tried to bring their old house across the ocean from Norway only for the waves to claim it. Even Louis, Edith's older brother, hadn't been gone a week before his shrine was erected. A hidden passage leads Edith to the room of Calvin and Sam, twin brothers whose fates diverged in the most tragic way possible. Calvin, at 11 years old, was determined to defy gravity, to fly. As his brother's words echo throughout time, Calvin swings higher and higher, the wind pushing him to impossible heights, until, finally, he lets go. He soars, and then he's gone. Sam, meanwhile, grew up in the same room until he was 18, then left for the military. Another secret passage, another story frozen in time. This time, it's Barbara, the child star turned cautionary tale. Her room is littered with memorabilia of her brief fame, but it's a worn-out comic book that tells her final tale. Through its illustrated pages, we relive her last moments. A bizarre slasher film sequence where reality and fiction blur. Was she killed by intruders? Did she simply disappear? The only certainty is that Walter, her little brother, hid under the bed that night and afterwards locked himself away in an underground bunker. Speaking of Walter, his story is one of routine. Day after day, year after year, he follows the same motions, sealed away in an underground bunker, convinced that whatever took Barbara would come for him too. Until one day, after decades of isolation, he decides to leave. The player watches him step out into the sunlight for the first time in a lifetime, only to be met, almost poetically, by the sound of an oncoming train. Edith follows Walter's path and eventually walks through the family cemetery, and it's here she reveals a quiet revelation. She's 22 weeks pregnant. Her journey isn't just for herself, it's for the child she carries, the one who will inherit what's left of the Finch name. The deeper she explores, the more Edith unravels the nature of her family's alleged curse. Her grandfather, Sam, died while trying to teach his daughter how to be strong. Her uncle, Gregory, drowned in a bathtub as a baby, lost in a world of imagination before he ever really had a chance to live. Her other uncle, Gus, was struck by a tent that was swept up by a storm, his life taken as he refused to acknowledge the changing tides of his family. Then there's Milton, his room, a castle of creativity, his presence still lingering in unfinished paintings and a mysterious flipbook. Unlike the others, Milton's story doesn't end in death, but in disappearance. He simply painted a door, then stepped through it. Gone. And then there's Louis, Of all the stories in the Finch house, Lewis's is arguably one of the most tragic, the most vivid. A young man trapped in the monotony of a cannery job, his mind escapes into a fantasy world of his own making. What begins as a simple daydream becomes an obsession, an alternate reality so intoxicating that the real world begins to fade. Until, in the end, Lewis makes a choice. Abandon reality completely and step into the world he created. The blade of the fish guillotine falls, and then silence. By the time Edith reaches her own childhood bedroom, the weight of everything is almost too much to bear. She turns the pages of her own diary and the player is taken back. Back to the night she and her mother fled. Dawn, desperate to break the cycle, tried to shield Edith from the family stories. But Edie, the keeper of the past, wanted her to remember. And so, in secret, Edith sneaks into the library, discovers the history of the Finches, and sees one last story, the night Edie walked to the house that sank after Odin died, which was the same night that Edith was born. But before Edith can finish reading it, Dawn rips the book from her hands. A final argument. A car pulling away in the dead of night. That's the last time Edith sees her great-grandmother alive. Years pass, and then the cycle begins again. Dawn succumbs to illness. Edith, now alone, discovers she's pregnant. And though she won't live long enough to tell her child these stories herself, she does the only thing she can. She writes them down. Because if they are remembered, then in some way, they still exist. And then the game ends. Her son, standing in the cemetery beside the Finch house, sets a bouquet down on his mother's grave. Thus, he and the stories are what remains of Edith Finch. As a reminder, I am not a psychologist or qualified to diagnose mental health conditions. Everything stated in this video is my personal opinion. I usually focus on psychological horror games on this channel, but while What Remains of Edith Finch isn't a horror game in the traditional sense, there's something off-putting about the Finch family and the house they left behind. Beyond the precarious architecture of its upper floors, the eeriness comes from the way each bedroom remains frozen in time, a meticulously preserved memorial that turns their legacy into something almost inescapable. As I dug deeper into this game, I discovered a dedicated fan base obsessed with unraveling its mysteries. People have spent years dissecting every Finch relative, trying to answer lingering questions. What really happened to Milton? Is the so-called Finch curse real? And why did Edie Finch outlive nearly all of her descendants? But this video isn't about solving the game's lore. Instead, I want to explore how the Finches coped with death, their unique, sometimes uncomfortable ways of processing loss, and why that has resonated so strongly with players. Many fans have described the Finch family as dysfunctional or even abusive because of their parenting choices and the ways they memorialized their dead. But beyond just the Finches, this game speaks to something universal, how we as people process grief. So today, I want to explore 3 key questions. Number 1, how do the Finches respond to death? 2, what makes their stories so unnerving to us? And 3, what does this game teach us about life? The Finch family spans 6 generations, counting Edith's son, and features 13 members illustrated in Edith's journal, along with those who married into the family. While we don't have insight into how every single member processed grief, either because the game doesn't make it clear or because they were too young when they passed, we do have enough information on several key figures. Those include Odin, Edie, Sam, Walter, Dawn, Gus to some extent, Lewis, Edith, and possibly even Edith's son. From these individuals, I've categorized their responses to death into 3 major groups. These categories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, as many of the Finches exhibited traits from multiple groups, which I'll explain shortly. The first group, which I call the runners, consists of those who sought to physically or emotionally distance themselves from death. The most prominent examples are Odin, Walter, and Dawn, with possible cases for Sam and Lewis. though I'll discuss them more in another section. Odin left Norway after the deaths of his wife Ingeborg and their son Johan. While it's implied Ingeborg may have died in childbirth, Odin seemed to attribute their deaths to the infamous Finch family curse, prompting his attempt to start anew in America. Beyond simply moving away, Odin also wrote books such as The Mysteries of Death and Thereafter and Joining the Great Majority, suggesting he processed grief through intellectual and possibly spiritual exploration. The titles of these books hint at religious or philosophical musings on the afterlife, which may have provided Odin with an alternative form of escapism. This could have influenced later generations, as the Finch house is overflowing with books, perhaps reflecting an ongoing search for meaning. Dawn mirrored her great-grandfather's tendency to move forward by leaving the past behind. After losing her siblings as a child, she relocated her belongings to the loft within her shared bedroom, perhaps to create emotional distance. Later, she moved to India to teach English, only returning to the Finch home after her husband's death. Once back, Dawn sealed off the bedrooms of deceased family members, physically shutting away their memories. When her son Milton disappeared and Lewis later died, her grief transformed into anger toward Edie, who insisted on preserving family stories. Whether Dawn's attempt to erase the past was her first or simply the final straw isn't clear, but it's evident that her way of coping clashed with Edie's. Walter took the most extreme approach, sealing himself away in a bunker for decades, repeating the same routine every day. His withdrawal was triggered by his sister Barbara's mysterious death, which he interpreted as the work of a monster coming for the Finches. Rather than confronting his fear, Walter escaped from the world entirely. Even when he finally decided to leave, he didn't use the basement exit, but instead smashed a hole into the outside world, emphasizing his complete rejection of the family home. The second group, which I call the Keepers, includes those who preserved family history and memorialized their lost relatives. The most prominent examples are Edie and Edith, with a potential case for Odin given his attempt to relocate the Finch house and his writings on death. Edie was the driving force behind the preservation of the Finch family legacy. She constructed the family cemetery even before the house was finished and created custom tombstones for each deceased member. She also painted portraits of them, displayed their belongings in their untouched bedrooms, and recorded their stories in a family journal intended for Edith. Edie didn't just memorialize the past, she embellished it, crafting mythical retellings of family tragedies. These included her husband's death being blamed on a dragon rather than a dragon-themed slide, and Walter being reimagined as a mole man living underground. Her dedication to remembrance shaped the house itself, making it a living museum of the Finch legacy. Edith, meanwhile, took a quieter approach to preservation. She documented her family's history in her journal, which she ultimately passed down to her son, who himself may have also been a keeper, since he traveled to the Finch house to pay respects to his late mother. Her journey back through the Finch house, retracing the final moments of each relative, serves as both her personal exploration of grief and a means of ensuring their stories live on. Even as a child, Edith showed curiosity about her family's past, though Dawn attempted to suppress it by keeping Edie's journal away from her. The final group consists of those whose responses to death are ambiguous or mixed. This includes relatives whose actions might be influenced by personal struggles rather than direct grief, as well as those who are too young for their responses to be fully understood. Molly, Calvin, Gus, Gregory, and Milton were all really young when they died or disappeared. Their behaviors may have been influenced by childhood impulsivity rather than a direct reaction to grief. However, some connections can be made. For example, Gus refusing to participate in his father's wedding after Gregory's death and his parents' divorce, potentially as an act of defiance against change. Barbara was only 3 years old when her sister Molly died, making it unclear if that loss affected her. However, she pursued a child acting career passionately, maybe as a way to seek validation and fill the void left by Molly. If so, the preserved nature of Molly's untouched bedroom may have been a constant, painful reminder. Sam experienced multiple losses as a child, including his twin brother Calvin and his older sister Barbara. Though he continued to live in the same room he once shared with Calvin until he turned 18, he later sought strength through military service. As an adult, he coped with further loss, such as divorce and the deaths of his children, by instilling resilience in his daughter Dawn. However, his letter about Calvin suggests he never forgot his love for his brother, and his reflections with Dawn indicate an effort to process his grief through storytelling. Lewis had perhaps the most tragic and complex response to grief. He was old enough to remember his brother Milton's disappearance and his father Sanjay's death, the latter of which severed his connection to his Indian heritage. Moving back into the Finch house, surrounded by rooms frozen in time as memorials, may have weighed on him. His job at the cannery, lacking any sense of purpose or growth, further contributed to his mental decline. Rather than engaging with his grief directly, Lewis escaped into an elaborate fantasy world, one that ultimately led to his demise. These categories aren't rigid. Many of the Finches exhibited multiple coping mechanisms. Some sought to escape death, while others sought to immortalize it. Some tried to move forward, while others clung to the past. These labels also aren't meant to be definitive, so I'd love to hear how you would categorize the Finches. But for now, let's move on to what makes their story so unnerving to us. While researching this game, I stumbled across quite a few comments calling the Finch family neglectful, abusive, or just downright eerie. A lot of that criticism stems from Edie's obsessive memorialization of her family, but also from the circumstances surrounding how certain family members died. Why place Calvin's swing so dangerously close to a cliff? Why did no one stop Gus from playing outside during a storm? Why did Kay leave baby Gregory alone in the bathtub to answer the phone? Why did Edie send Molly to bed without dinner? And then there's Edie. Some players find her behavior especially unsettling. The fact that she went to such lengths to preserve each family member's memory, keeping their bedrooms untouched, commissioning portrait paintings, and customizing tombstones, the house feels less like a home and more like a museum of tragedy. What's even more disturbing is how young so many of these family members were when they died, many before they had a real chance to experience life beyond the walls of the Finch home. Death is constant, and the family just keeps moving forward. On the surface, it's easy to see why people think the family is strange or negligent, but for me, what's truly unsettling is how directly and almost matter-of-factly the game confronts death. Many stories are about losing one person and learning to move on, whereas here, we watch death claim family member after family member, and we see each survivor process it in vastly different ways. We get intimate access to their private, vulnerable moments, all through Edith's eyes, while also witnessing her struggle to make sense of her family's tragic history. But I also kept wondering, are these reactions and circumstances really that far-fetched? The Finch family lived mostly during the 20th century, a time when children were often left to their own devices in ways we might now consider dangerous. There were fewer safety standards, and children had more freedom to roam, explore, and take risks. Think of climbing trees without helmets, or playing on tall metal jungle gyms with concrete underneath. Calvin's swing being close to a cliff edge sounds reckless today, but it might have just been a product of the times. I found an article that looked at differences in perceived play in the 20th century compared to today, with one section quoting older participants perceiving they had more freedom to play as kids than younger participants, which may coincide with Calvin's childhood experiences. Molly's situation could also be seen through that lens. Maybe she was sent to bed without dinner as punishment, a parenting tactic that, to this day, still seems to be a debated topic. Or maybe she was sick and her mother withheld food to keep her from getting worse. Perhaps she had been caught sneaking out of her window, and her parents' reaction was to lock the window and send her to bed hungry. What feels harsh to us may have simply been normal to them. Before I move on, I wanted to include a quick bonus section that I missed in my initial script. So here's a little post-production addition. I mentioned how unusual Edie's way of memorializing her family seemed, but what I didn't fully touch on is the potential cultural influence behind those behaviors. The only background we have on Edie is that her father immigrated to America from Norway, and she was already an adult at that time. In doing some brief research on Scandinavian customs, I found that while modern Norwegian practices often resemble Western Christian traditions, like holding church funerals, there's also a strong cultural emphasis on maintaining cemeteries with well-tended, carefully preserved gravestones. Going even further back into Scandinavian traditions, storytelling was central to how myths, legends, and histories were passed down, especially in Norse culture, where tales of the afterlife and heroic journeys were common. With that in mind, it's possible Edie's Norwegian roots played a role in her desire to create vivid, almost mythical stories about her family members and preserve their memory in elaborate ways. While later generations of the Finch family appear to have other cultural influences, such as some Indian heritage, these don't seem to be reflected in the family's traditions, perhaps because assimilation into American culture had already taken place. The family name itself, Finch, is of English origin. It's likely their original Norwegian surname was anglicized when they arrived in the US. On top of that, Edie gave all her children very American names rather than Norwegian ones. That contrast may have further created a cultural disconnect in how different generations of the family viewed and processed death. What may have been Edie's deeply ingrained way of honoring the dead could have seemed strange or excessive to her more Americanized descendants. Alright, with that little cultural detour out of the way, let's head back into our main discussion. We might look at these choices with disbelief because some of us grew up with parents who hovered, protected, and made sure we were safe and fed. But every family has its quirks. And in some ways, the Finch family's behaviors echo coping mechanisms we still see today. Some parents keep their child's bedroom exactly the way they left it after they pass. Some hold on to belongings for a source of comfort. Others turn to faith, placing their comfort in a higher power. And some just try to steal away the past and move on. The Finch family just happens to show every one of these reactions in full force. Which brings me to the bigger question. After all this death, what does this game teach us about life? Death is an unavoidable part of life, and it can be terrifying. For some, the fear lies in the unknown of what comes after, while for others, it's the consequences of death, being forgotten, leaving no mark on the world, or leaving loved ones behind. And while people turn to different coping mechanisms to ease their grief, there's something comforting to remember. The person you're grieving existed. They shared space on this earth, even if only for a short while. Maybe they brought you joy that made life feel richer. And maybe you do the same for others. We're social beings by nature, and as I've mentioned on this channel before, having a loving community, whether it's friends, family, or chosen connections, can help carry you through the darkest moments of loss, and also make life's happiest moments even brighter. The Finch family experienced loss after loss, and Edie arguably carried the heaviest burden, living long enough to see most of her family pass before her, and then losing her own life after Dawn and Edith left. Her ways of grieving might seem unusual or even unsettling, but they could just be the actions of a deeply mourning daughter, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Each family member dealt with their grief differently, whether their reactions seemed strange to us or hit close to home. Maybe you or someone you care about has gone through grief like this, so what can you do to help support someone in that place? Support looks different for everyone and depends on your relationship with them, but a good starting point is simply being there, listening, showing kindness, and offering help without trying to minimize their loss. Avoid saying, "I understand," if you don't, and don't shy away from the conversation if they need to talk about it. I found a study that surveyed around 600 bereaved people and highlighted what support felt most and least helpful. The most meaningful gestures were making the grieving person feel heard and included, while the most hurtful were absence, silence, or insensitivity from those around them, whether family, friends, coworkers, or professionals. It's a reminder that even small expressions of empathy and care can make a huge difference. What Remains of Edith Finch isn't a game that asks you to win. There's no final boss to defeat, no skill to master, because that's not what it's about. Instead, it gives you a collection of stories, memories frozen in time, and asks you to step inside them, to live through them, even if just for a moment. But here's the thing, these stories don't offer easy answers. There's no grand revelation waiting at the end, no neatly tied up resolution. Just like grief itself, Edith Finch doesn't follow a straight path. It meanders, shifts, and morphs into something different for every person who plays it. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Psychologically, this game teaches us something profound about loss. That it isn't something we conquer or outrun, it's something we carry. And over time, that weight doesn't necessarily disappear, but it changes. It transforms from something crushing into something that just is, woven into who we are. The Finch family may be gone, but their stories remain. Their voices linger in the walls of that house, in the pages of Edith's journal, and in the memories passed down through generations. And maybe that's the most important thing What Remains of Edith Finch has to say about grief. That the people we lose never truly leave us. They exist in the stories we tell, in the echoes of their laughter, in the moments we remember when we least expect it. And in that way, they're never really gone, because at the end of the day, we're all just stories waiting to be told, and maybe that's enough. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. If there's anything you feel I've missed from a psychological analysis perspective, have a different view about any of the characters, or would like to see me explore a particular character in detail in another video, please let me know in the comments below. I'm interested to hear your take on the subject. I'm also open to hear any suggestions you have for next games I should cover. Otherwise, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next game.